Hello, glad to see you on the channel. Subscribe, leave a like, and don't forget to write a comment. Enjoy watching.
New Year's Day had always been my mother's high holy holiday. Not Christmas, not Thanksgiving, not even her own birthday compared. She believed how you began the year set the tone for the next 12 months, so brunch was always a production. Fresh linens ironed within an inch of their lives, overpriced centerpieces that smelled like a Pier 1 threw up, and plates so white and spotless they made you nervous just looking at them. There was champagne, of course, always champagne, poured into crystal flutes she only took out once a year and washed by hand with surgical precision. The house smelled like cinnamon rolls and nervous tension, the former intentional, the latter not. I arrived on time, as I always did, dressed nice but not flashy, polite but not desperate. I brought a modest bottle of Prosecco and a carefully wrapped gift, square, simple, and heavy. I placed it under the tree, still up and glittering, although the needles were already starting to fall. My father, Richard, nodded at me from his place in the armchair, half asleep already despite it being only 10:30 in the morning. He always drank too much on New Year's Eve and looked like an exhausted priest the next day, quiet, gruff, slightly annoyed by everything that breathed. My mother, Carol, was in full hostess mode, smiling so hard you could hear her jaw creak, commenting on every little detail like a drill sergeant disguised as Martha Stewart. "You look tired, honey," she said instead of hello. "Are you getting enough sleep? You always did have those dark circles." I smiled the way you do when your teeth hurt, but the dentist says it's all in your head. "Great to see you too, Mom. Everything looks beautiful." She nodded like a queen accepting tribute. "I just hope your brother appreciates it." "Ah, yes. Jason." He arrived 40 minutes late, as expected, bursting through the front door with the dramatic flair of someone who has never been punished for making others wait. He was tan despite it being winter in Pennsylvania, wearing a cashmere sweater he probably hadn't paid for and sunglasses he didn't bother to take off indoors. He walked in like the prodigal son returning from battle, not from wherever the hell he was living now. Last I heard it was Miami, but he never stayed put for long. Carol practically squealed and rushed to hug him, and my father stood up for the first time all morning. You'd think Tom Brady just walked in. "Look who's finally here," my mother said, gripping Jason like he'd been gone for 10 years instead of 10 months. Jason kissed her on the cheek and grinned. "Sorry I'm late. Traffic was a nightmare." There was no traffic. We lived in a suburb where the only rush hour was when the dog barked at the garbage truck. No one asked what kind of job Jason actually had these days. No one dared. We sat down at the table, the four of us, a perfect nuclear family on the outside, something far more radioactive underneath. My mother had made her famous quiche, 2 types, as always, because Jason was lactose intolerant and I apparently liked anything. The flutes were filled and my father raised his glass. To Jason, he said, for his new position. We couldn't be prouder. I swallowed a mouthful of mimosa that tasted suddenly sour. Jason grinned and ducked his head like he was being modest, though his eyes were scanning the room for the next compliment. And Carol added, beaming, "We want to help you get started in the new year." She pulled out a white envelope, the kind banks use for mortgage documents or wedding cards. With a flourish, she handed it to him across the table. He opened it and smiled wider. No one said how much was in it, but the thickness spoke volumes. "That's incredibly generous," Jason said, barely disguising the lack of surprise. Like he'd known it was coming. "That's what family does," my mother replied. I stabbed my fork into a pile of roasted potatoes, chewing slowly, focusing on the crunch just to avoid saying something stupid. Or true. Jason had been the star since birth, the one with the trophies, the charm, the bad report cards that somehow became funny anecdotes. I'd been the steady one. The one who did the dishes and got the degrees and never crashed a car or skipped rent. I paid my own way through college while Jason went to 3 different schools and never finished one. I kept the lights on when Dad got sick 3 winters ago, when Jason was too busy consulting to pick up the phone. But none of that ever made it into a toast. Carol turned to me finally, as if remembering I was present. You brought a gift, didn't you, Claire? I did, I said, wiping my mouth and smiling just enough. It's under the tree. Something small. Jason leaned back in his chair, satisfied, already reaching for a second glass of champagne. Bet you didn't get me another tie, did you? He joked, and everyone chuckled like he was a stand-up comic. I stood to refill my drink, hand steady, smile fixed. Because today wasn't about arguing. Today was about revealing. I'd spent months preparing this exact moment, and I wasn't about to let Jason, or our parents, laugh their way past it. I looked at the envelope in Jason's hand, and then at the one under the tree, square and heavy and quiet. But this time, I said under my breath, almost like a prayer, I brought a little something of my own. There's a certain kind of silence that only settles in after a fresh betrayal, one that isn't loud or dramatic but quiet, creeping, like fog rolling in across your porch at dawn. You don't scream, you don't cry, because you're not surprised, you're just reminded. And sitting at that brunch table, watching Jason fold the check neatly and tuck it into his wallet without even a whisper of gratitude, I wasn't surprised. I was reminded. Reminded that in this house, I had always been the extra fork at dinner, the spare key no one ever used, the understudy who never quite got the chance to go on stage. It's easy to say you're over it when you're far away, building a life somewhere else, paying your bills, not calling too often, not needing anyone's praise. But when you're sitting across from the same faces that once told you to be quiet, to be patient, to be proud of your little brother because he just has a different kind of spark, that old ache wakes up like it never left. Jason crashed his first car at 17, not because of a snowstorm or a deer on the road, but because he was showing off for a girl, speeding down Hollow Ridge Road while blasting Blink 182 like it was some kind of soundtrack to his idiocy. He walked away with barely a scratch, and 3 months later, they gave him another car. Nicer, newer, shinier. The message wasn't lost on me. You screw up, you get rewarded. I play it safe, and I'm told, you're so independent, sweetie. You don't need anything. I paid for community college with 3 part-time jobs and a line of credit I didn't pay off until I was 32. When I finally got my own car, a used Honda Civic with a dented door, I cried. Not because it was beautiful, but because no one helped me get it. I used to think if I just achieved enough, did everything right, they'd notice. They'd see me. They'd put down the champagne glasses and say, hey, Claire's doing something incredible, too. But instead, I became invisible in direct proportion to how functional I was. Jason, with his drama, his unemployment stints disguised as sabbaticals, his string of breakups with women who all mysteriously hated my mother, he was the center of every story, every phone call, every check. There was that one Christmas, it must have been 5 years ago, when Jason forgot my birthday. Not belated, not confused by the date, just completely erased it from his memory like it never mattered. I sat there on Christmas Eve, 28 years old, watching him unwrap a smartwatch while I got a scented candle and a regifted sweater that still had someone else's tag inside. I didn't say anything then, either. I just smiled and sipped my wine, wondering when exactly it became easier to pretend I didn't care than to admit that I did. Back in the dining room, Jason was telling some over-polished story about a client dinner in Miami, using words like leverage and pipeline and scalability like he actually knew what they meant. My father nodded along, looking vaguely impressed, while my mother beamed like she'd birthed a Wall Street savant. Jason leaned back in his chair, tapping the edge of his glass like he was waiting to be interviewed. We just closed a deal north of $5 million, he said, with the kind of casual arrogance that people only develop when they've never had to cover rent with a Visa card. And I might be heading to Berlin next month. Lotta international interest right now. I almost laughed out loud, not because it was funny, but because I knew damn well that Jason had been fired from his last job 3 months ago. I'd seen the email. It had been accidentally forwarded to me, of all people. He was no longer with the firm due to performance concerns, and yet here he was, playing hotshot financier while our parents swallowed every lie like it was communion. "You always were our little businessman," my mother said, and I could hear it again. That subtext, that coded message she never said out loud. "You were always more interesting than your sister. Claire's nice, but you're the one we tell stories about." I remembered how they gave Jason $10,000 for his wedding, a ceremony he called off 6 weeks before it happened, while I got a $100 Amazon gift card when I finally bought my house. And not even a handwritten note to go with it. I guess I should have been grateful. $100 is still something, right? Hell, maybe I could buy myself a vacuum to clean up my own pride. Jason started talking again, this time about angel investors and next quarter projections, words I was sure he'd picked up from a podcast and decided to pass off as lived experience. I couldn't take it anymore. "Hey," I said, cutting into the noise, voice calm and steady like a loaded gun wrapped in velvet. "Since we're all celebrating today, I brought a gift too." Jason looked over, surprised I'd spoken. My mother's eyes narrowed slightly, as if I'd just interrupted something sacred. I smiled politely and pointed toward the tree. "It's under there. Just something small I put together. Thought it might be fun." The room quieted just enough for the champagne bubbles to become audible again. Jason blinked, then shrugged, clearly uninterested. My father looked over his glasses at the box, then at me, already bored. But I knew what I'd done. I'd started the clock. And there was no stopping it now. There's something powerful about watching people unwrap something when they believe they know what's inside, especially when they think it's a sentimental token, a sweet little memento from the daughter who always remembered birthdays, never caused a fuss, and made polite conversation even when someone else was stealing the spotlight right out from under her. So when I handed my mother the thick leather-bound envelope, tied with a silk ribbon and sealed with a delicate wax stamp, she looked at it the way you look at a cherished family recipe passed down through generations, with warmth, nostalgia, and the smug comfort of being adored. "This looks expensive," she said, running her fingers along the spine, her polished nails clinking softly against the brass corners. She always had a taste for presentation, for things that looked like they came from a catalog or a Hallmark commercial. "It's handmade," I told her, smiling just wide enough to keep it polite. I thought it was time we had something personal. Jason let out a soft scoff from across the table, half interested and already lifting his glass for another celebratory gulp. Dad barely looked up from the plate in front of him, carving into a second helping of ham like he was trying to stay out of whatever awkward family moment was about to unfold. I could feel the shift in the air like a storm front rolling in, unnoticed by everyone but me. My mother untied the ribbon carefully, as if unwrapping a newborn, and opened the cover with reverence. The first page was blank, intentionally so, just thick cream paper with a single gold-stamped line at the bottom, "Memories we never talk about." Her brow furrowed, but she flipped to the next page, expecting childhood snapshots, maybe a Christmas card from the 90s, or some overexposed Polaroids of Jason and me in Halloween costumes. Instead, her fingers paused mid-turn. Jason, 22 years old, sprawled on a leather couch in Cancun, shirt half off, face slack with drunken sleep. A glass table in front of him bore the clear evidence of a night gone too far, an empty tequila bottle, a rolled-up dollar bill, and a line of white powder that didn't leave much to the imagination. In the corner of the photo, barely in frame, a bikini-clad girl held up 2 middle fingers, her eyes glassy and bloodshot. My mother's hands trembled slightly, her eyes narrowing as she leaned in, trying to convince herself it was a joke, some Photoshop prank or a terrible mistake. "What is this?" she asked, but she didn't look at me. "Page 2's good too," I said, voice steady and low. She flipped it like it was burning her fingers, and the next photo slid into view, this time, a picture taken in Jason's garage from a few months ago. There, shoved under a plastic tarp next to an unused treadmill, was the laptop his former company had declared lost when he left. A close-up shot followed on the next page, showing the company's property tag, still attached, still clearly visible. Jason's chair scraped against the floor as he leaned forward suddenly, all the smug charm drained from his face. "Where the hell did you get these?" he asked, his voice catching somewhere between a whisper and a snarl. "I keep things," I said simply, my eyes never leaving my mother's face. "You'd be surprised how much fits between the cracks when no one's looking at you." Carol flipped another page, hands now shaking in earnest. This time it was a printed email from Human Resources, subject line, "Termination of employment. Confidential." Jason's full name was bolded at the top, followed by a paragraph that started with "due to ongoing performance issues and unapproved absences." I didn't need to read the rest out loud. The room had gone so quiet, I could hear the blood in my own ears. "Jason," Dad's voice was thin, like he'd aged 10 years in 1 minute. "Is this true?" Jason's jaw clenched. "That's taken out of context." I laughed once, sharp and fast. "Sure. Like you were just borrowing the laptop for safekeeping? Or vacationing in Cancun with powdered sugar." "This is disgusting," Carol said, though she wasn't looking at the photos anymore. She was looking at me like I'd spit in the mashed potatoes. "No, Mom," I said slowly, clearly, making sure the words cut through the years of willful ignorance. "What's disgusting is how you reward him for pretending to be someone he's not, while I spent my entire life trying to earn one honest moment of recognition from either of you." She stared at the album again, like maybe if she blinked hard enough, it would turn into baby pictures and pressed daisies. "Why would you do this?" she whispered. I let the silence stretch for a few seconds, not because I didn't know the answer, but because I wanted the room to sit in the discomfort it had avoided for far too long. "You all made a story," I said finally. "A perfect little myth about Jason, the successful son, the bright one, the charmer. And I let you tell it over and over. But myths only work when everyone keeps their mouth shut." Carol reached out like she wanted to close the album, to hide it, to bury it under polite conversation and another round of bubbly. I placed my hand on top of hers, gently but firmly. "Don't worry," I said. "It's not for the neighbors. It's just for us." Her voice was barely audible, barely anything at all. "What is this?" And I answered, without blinking, "Proof." For a few long seconds after I said the word proof, no one moved, no one breathed, and no one dared to touch the album again, as if something inside of it might be contagious, not a disease, but something worse, something like shame. Then Jason, predictably, exploded. He launched out of his chair so fast he knocked over his champagne flute, splashing gold fizz all over the white linen and catching the edge of a plate that skidded across the table like a hockey puck. "You're out of your goddamn mind," he spat, his voice cracking somewhere between fury and panic, the kind of panic that only shows up when someone realizes the story they've been spinning is finally unraveling in real time. "This is sick. Claire, you've been spying on me? Digging through my stuff like some lunatic? This is harassment." My mother gasped, the kind of theatrical gasp that sounded like something out of a bad soap opera, pressing her hand to her chest as if I had just pulled a knife instead of a photo album. My father, still quiet and blinking slowly, looked not so much angry as confused, like the words were swimming too fast in his head to catch one. "You lied to all of us," I said, my voice calm, level, sharp as glass. "And you've been doing it for years. You think I don't know how many times you've asked them for money behind the scenes? How many fake business ventures you've started? How many jobs you've quit before the probation period even ended?" Jason moved toward me like he was about to yank the album out of my mother's hands, but I stepped between them and pulled out my phone, the modern sword in this particular duel. I scrolled through a folder labeled Jason, opened the first audio clip, and pressed play. His voice came through the speaker, slurred but still distinct. "Yeah, man, I told them I was working remote, but I just stopped showing up. Whatever, it's not like they check payroll that close." Carol clapped her hands over her ears like a child, like hearing her perfect son's voice would somehow pollute her soul, while my father finally let out a noise, not a word, just a long, low groan that sounded like the floor had dropped out beneath him. Jason's face flushed red, but he wasn't giving up yet. He turned to me again, now pointing, now sneering. "You think you're some kind of hero?" he shouted. "You think showing up with a fucking scrapbook makes you better than me?" I turned off the recording and held up the screen so they could see the spreadsheet behind it, rows of dates, amounts, and transactions. "No," I said, still calm, still terrifying in my calm. "Paying your rent for 6 months made me better than you. But don't worry, I didn't do it for you. I did it because I knew if you got evicted, you'd move back in here, and I wasn't about to clean up that mess, too." My mother stood then, shaking, her eyes glassy and full of that old fire, not love, not concern, but control. She pointed at me now, not Jason, and her voice cracked open with rage. "This isn't what family does," she hissed, as if by saying it with enough certainty, she could make it true. "We don't humiliate each other like this." I laughed, bitter and sharp, a sound that startled even me. "You're damn right. I learned that from you. Watching how you treated me, how you let him fail upwards while I had to work 3 jobs and still got less attention than the damn dog." Carol's lip trembled, but no apology came. There never was one. Not when I was 15 and Jason skipped out on his curfew and blamed it on me. Not when I graduated with honors and they gave me a toaster. Not when I paid off their second mortgage 3 years ago after Dad got sick and Jason suddenly went off the grid. And they never told anyone. Never thanked me. Never once mentioned it out loud. "You paid off the house?" my father asked, his voice barely audible, eyes squinting like he was trying to remember something that got buried under 1,000 willful blind spots. "I paid it off," I said, nodding. "You were too proud to ask, and Jason sure as hell wasn't going to help. So I did. Quietly. Like always." There was a long pause, a gap filled only by the ticking of the wall clock and the far-off sound of a neighbor's leaf blower, life going on just fine, unaware that inside this house, the foundations of a family were finally cracking all the way through. Jason sat back down, defeated now, eyes burning holes in the tablecloth, unable to look at anyone. Carol didn't sit. She just stood there, hand clutching the edge of her chair like she was steadying herself against a revelation she refused to accept. "You think you're so righteous," she said, her voice trembling with something that might have been regret if it weren't so defensive. "But you made this ugly. You could have talked to us." "I did," I replied, louder now with the finality of a gavel striking wood. "You just never listened." I looked at the album on the table, pages still open like an autopsy of everything we'd tried to ignore, everything they'd chosen not to see. I took one final sip of cold mimosa, set the glass down, and reached for my coat. Jason muttered something under his breath, but I didn't catch it and didn't care to ask. "I'm done being the family's plan B," I said, voice steady, no tears, no tremor, just truth laid bare. "Let Jason be the golden boy. Let him tell the stories. I'm not in them anyway." I walked toward the door, past the tree still lit up like it was trying to convince someone this was a happy home, and opened it to the biting January air. I didn't slam it, didn't make a scene. I just walked out, and for once I knew they'd remember every step. I had one hand on the doorknob and the other wrapped around my keys, ready to leave the mess behind like a house fire you don't look back at, not because you don't care, but because if you do, the smoke gets in your eyes and the guilt creeps into your lungs. I was halfway across the threshold when I heard my mother's voice, sharp, cold, and full of that signature blend of denial and righteousness she'd perfected over a lifetime. "You've embarrassed us," she said, the words landing heavy and loud in a room already stripped bare of illusions. "Not him, not Jason, not your brother has lied to us for years, but you, me, the one who pulled back the curtain and forced them to look at what they'd spent years pretending wasn't there." I stopped, not because I doubted myself, not because her words struck some hidden nerve, but because there was still one more page in that album, still one more nail in the illusion, and it deserved to be seen. I turned slowly, letting the silence stretch and crack around me, walked back across the room, and picked up the album, its weight a little heavier now that it had done its damage. I flipped through the pages one last time, not for dramatic effect, but because I wanted them to watch. I wanted them to see the final entry, the one they would never be able to explain away. This, I said, laying the last page flat on the table, is a check receipt from my account, dated back 6 months. The printed image was clean, unmistakable, a direct deposit to Jason's landlord, every month like clockwork, signed with my name. The amount was clear. The memo line said it all: rent assistance for Jason B. Do not disclose. My mother stared at it, blinking hard, her mouth opening just a little before closing again, like she couldn't decide which lie would work best in this moment. My father leaned closer, adjusting his glasses like the math might make more sense if he squinted hard enough. I didn't do it for him, I said, my voice quieter now, but somehow heavier, denser. I did it because I knew if I didn't, you'd let him move back in here. And I couldn't stomach watching you pretend that was a favor instead of a burden. Jason didn't say a word. For once, the great orator of family myth and financial fiction had nothing to say. He looked at the table, not at me, not at anyone, just stared like maybe the patterns in the tablecloth could save him from this moment. The silence in the room was pure, raw, almost holy, the kind of silence that doesn't beg to be filled, the kind that says this is the truth and there's nowhere to run. I closed the album gently, as if it were a relic, then pushed it across the table like a final offering. You can keep it, I said. Frame the cover if you want. Or burn it. I really don't care anymore. I turned again, slower this time, feeling the weight of finality settle on my shoulders. No one followed me. No one called out. No one begged me to stay. Outside, the air was colder than I remembered, sharp, biting, the kind of cold that makes your teeth hurt and your memories feel harder than they should. I unlocked my car, got in, and sat for a second with the engine off. My hands shook a little, but not from fear or regret. From the adrenaline that always comes after you finally said the thing you weren't supposed to say. Some truths don't need to be screamed. They just need to be opened at brunch. I watched the frost melt on the windshield as the heater hummed to life, my breath fogging the glass in slow, deliberate bursts. The album was still inside, probably untouched, maybe still being stared at like it might rearrange itself into something more palatable. But that wasn't my problem anymore. I drove through the empty neighborhood streets with their pale holiday lights still clinging to gutters and fences, like everyone was too tired or too sentimental to take them down just yet. I passed the old playground Jason and I used to ride our bikes past, the church where they still held bake sales every third Sunday, the gas station where I bought my first coffee the morning after I left for college. All of it so familiar, so unchanged, and yet it felt 100 miles behind me already. I thought revenge would taste sweeter than this, maybe something like honey with a bite of whiskey at the end, warm and sharp and final. But the truth? It tasted like tap water after a long run. Cleansing. Necessary. But not satisfying. At a red light, I glanced at my phone, still face down on the passenger seat. I turned it over and there it was, one new voicemail. Jason. He must have called while I was still in the house, or maybe while I was backing out of the driveway, cowardly enough not to say something to my face, but not brave enough to stay silent altogether. The little red blinked, waiting for me to press play, to open the door one more time, even just a crack. I stared at it for a long minute, thumb hovering over the screen, mind running through 1,000 possibilities, an apology, a threat, a pathetic attempt at damage control, or worse. One of those fake deep monologues he always pulled when he thought sincerity could mask the rot underneath. I didn't press it. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Instead, I rolled down the window just a crack, breathed in the sharp air, and let the silence fill the space between who I had been and who I was finally becoming. Letting go doesn't always feel good. Sometimes it just feels quiet. And maybe that's enough.